This book is called the Collected Works of Frederick Douglass, and I'm going to read to you some of the things I underlined in the chapter called The Inhumanity of Slavery. It says it's an extract from a lecture on slavery at Rochester, December 8th, 1850. I'm going to read to you right out of the first chapter first. The relation of master and slave has been called patriarchal, and only second in benignity and tenderness to that of the parent and child. This representation is doubtless believed by many northern people, and this may account in part for the lack of interest which we find among persons whom we are bound to believe to be honest and humane. What then are the facts? Here I will not quote my own experience in slavery, for this you might call one-sided testimony. I will not cite the Declaration of Abolitionists, for these you might pronounce exaggerations. I will not rely upon advertisements cut from newspapers, for these you might call isolated cases. But I will refer you to the laws adopted by the legislatures of the slave states. I give you such evidence because it cannot be invalidated nor denied. I hold in my hand sundry extracts from the slave codes of our country, from which I will quote. So I will go and read to you some things that I underline here in the chapter. Frederick says, I admit that there are individual slave holders less cruel and barbarous than is allowed by law, but these form the exception. The majority of slaveholders find it necessary to ensure obedience, at times to avail themselves of the utmost extent of the law, and many go beyond it. One of the most telling testimonies against the pretended kindness of slaveholders is the fact that uncounted numbers of fugitives are now inhabiting the dismal swamp, preferring the untamed wilderness to their cultivated homes, choosing rather to encounter hunger and thirst and to roam with the wild beasts of the forest, running the hazard of being hunted and shot down than to submit to the authority of kind masters. She's talking about how slaves choose to run away and risk their lives instead of staying in the comforts of the slave quarters. He leaves the man of the Bible and takes refuge with the man of the tomahawk. He quits the home of men for the haunts of wolves. The answer to that view is that slavery is in itself an abuse, that it lives by abuse and dies by the absence of abuse. He goes on to talk about this, as was said by slaveholder, the Reverend A.G. Few, to the Methodist Conference. If the relation be right, the means to maintain it also right. For without those means, slavery could not exist. Remove the dreadful scourge, the plaited thong, the galling fetter, the accursed chain, and let the slaveholder rely solely upon moral and religious power by which to secure obedience to his orders. And how long do you suppose a slave would maintain on the plantation? Absolute and arbitrary power can never be maintained by one man over the body and soul of another man without brutal chastisement and enormous cruelty. To talk of kindness entering into a relation in which one partly is robbed of wife, of children, and of his earnings, of home, of friends, of society, of knowledge, and of all that makes his life desirable is most absurd, wicked, and preposterous. The pestiferous breath of slavery taints the whole moral atmosphere of the North and enervates the moral energies of the whole people. The Northern people have been long connected with slavery. They have been linked to a decaying corpse, which has destroyed the moral health. In a high moral sense, as well as in a national sense, the whole American people are responsible for slavery and must share in its guilt and shame with the most obdurate men stealers of the South. Even now, an American abroad is pointed out in the crowd as coming from a land where men gain their fortunes by the bloods of souls, from a land of slave markets, of bloodhounds and slave hunters, and in circles. Such a man is shunned altogether as a moral pest. Let me say again, slavery is alike the sin and the shame of the American people. It is a blot upon the American name, and the only national reproach which need make an American hang its head in shame in the presence of monarchical governments. Slavery blunts the edge of all our rebukes of tyranny abroad. The criticisms that we make upon other nations only call forth ridicule, contempt, and scorn. Not to sustain an egregious wrong, but to unite all our energies in the grand effort to remedy that wrong. What has once been may be again. It was the sage of the Old Dominion that said, while speaking of the possibility of a conflict between the slave and the slaveholders, God has no attribute that could take sides with the oppressor in such a contest. I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever. Such is the warning voice of Thomas Jefferson, and every day's experience since his utterance until now confirms its wisdom and commends its truth. So once again, this was Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass's selected works. This is a extract from a lecture he gave at Rochester in December 8th, 1850. It's called The Inhumanity of Slavery. If you like this video, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and message. Once again, this wasn't the entire chapter. I did read some things that I underlined in the chapter. Thank you.